My paper is entitled The Minimal Facts Argument for the Resurrection of Jesus, a response to Dale Allison. At the outset, I wish to note my appreciation for another opportunity to engage ideas with Dale regarding the central topic in the New Testament. Dale and I have had a few earlier discussions on the same topic, both oral and written. Without the slightest hesitation, I affirm that Dale has been a good friend and I respect the views that he expresses in his 2 resurrection volumes. His ideas have always pushed further my own research. None of my comments here, though, should be construed as being aimed at him personally, for they're not. Yet it is obvious that Dale and I have some major differences. In this essay, I will endeavor to direct my comments to a few of his chief areas. Hopefully, the contrast will create much more light than heat. The structure of the minimal facts argument. Very briefly, the minimal facts case makes 2 chief moves. First, by far the most crucial step is that the separate historical and other data enumerated in this category are each buttressed by many areas of support. Though lagging well behind this initial move, the second step points out that a large majority of critical scholars recognizes the historicity of each fact. Now, it has been stated on several occasions that the minimal facts argument is very well accepted, especially among Christian apologists. One researcher who opposes this method still acknowledges that it has enjoyed, quote, near exclusive use, end quote, among apologists. Personally, I seriously doubt anywhere near that level of popularity for this method. Still, any amount of usage should be based on a solid foundation. In his latest resurrection work, Dale includes a section on the minimal facts as implemented by Michael Cohn and myself. While being rather positive as a whole, he also includes a number of caveats. Some of these questions are addressed in this essay, and then recently, in another interview, Dale made the following statement, quote, "I think the minimal facts argument is the best of the apologetical arguments. My skeptical approach doesn't deny any of the minimal facts," close quote. Okay, this begins my rejoinder to Dale on the subject. Dale's kind overall reaction to the minimal facts argument, while still having some concerns, leads to further discussion. The first concern is group hallucinations. Seems like this is getting a lot of attention today. Throughout Dale's 2 volumes, hallucination may very well occupy the most space among all his discussions of potential natural explanation for Jesus' resurrection. Occasionally, Dale appears to overstate or even overvaluate the evidence of certain counter cases or approaches. For an example, in one discussion of collective appearances, Dale discusses together the phenomena of mass hysteria, visions of spectral armies, Marian apparitions, mass hallucinations, and near-death experiences, all within just 2 paragraphs. In another instance, in a section on hallucinations also, Dale discusses mass hysteria, optical delusions, Bigfoot reports, and other nondescript visions, all again within 2 paragraphs. I'm not saying he discusses these, but they're listed. But many of these are not what are normally considered to be hallucinations. Careful distinctions need to be made without mixing heterogeneous accounts. Some definitions are needed. Hallucinations, claims to see something or someone for which there's no external referent beyond thin air, need to be contrasted with illusions, which where one's perception is taken to be something or someone else, like a real bear being interpreted as Bigfoot, and delusions, typically fraught with notions of mental illness of some species. Dale sometimes provides lists of various collective visions. By occasionally combining these unconnected groups, the end result may seem like an uneven judgment regarding the phenomena themselves. However, Dale is totally correct in his comment that in many group settings, where it may be thought that everyone viewed the same thing, it is often discovered later that many of these persons present actually saw different images or no images at all. So where does this leave the possibility of group hallucinations? 2 conclusions will be mentioned here. Initially, a number of physicians, psychologists, and other experts who have concluded that there are no known cases of group hallucinations that are described in the relevant medical literature. In a comprehensive data-based search of the PubMed and American Psychological Association websites, physician Joseph Bergeron did not discover a single reference to group hallucinations. Likewise, licensed clinical psychologist 𝐫𝐢𝐥𝐴 confirmed, quote, "I've surveyed the professional literature written by psychologists, psychiatrists, and other relevant healthcare professionals during the past 2 decades, and have yet to find a single documented case of a group hallucination, that is, an event for which more than one person purportedly shared in a visual or other sensory perception where there was clearly no external referent," end quote. 2 other influential research psychologists, Dale Allison and Frank Roy, wrote a major research volume on hallucinations for the American Psychological Association, commenting that the general supposition made by theorists is that, quote, "hallucinations are private events," end quote. They did raise some questions, although not concerning anything being discussed here. In answer to my own question, Leroy wrote to me in 2019, quote, "In general, true collective misperceptions are more commonly illusions." I know Mike also wrote to him, and he's got a different report if he wants to create time for it later. Then what about the stronger cases? Just a few possibilities are in order. Initially, rigorous definitional differences need to be utilized. Further, the valuable comment raised by Dale could be a real key here, namely that group events definitely do not rule out many different perceptions or none at all. I know personally of a situation where a fellow made well over a dozen trips to Medjugorje, and though the supposed phenomena, he supported it, but he never witnessed anything out of the ordinary in these more than 12 trips. Nothing on either the ground or in the sun, if you're familiar with that case. But then what if many of these experiences really did appear to be the same, as indicated by detailed interviews later? We have to be open to that. Even so, there are still contrary data from those present. We just mentioned it. Further, the observations reported about what are in those groups may have been seen cheaply and may have been due to exaggeration or hearsay. All these questions, among other considerations, have to be assessed. 2 other psychologists, 𝐧𝐳𝐸 and Jones, argued that expectation, emotional excitement, etc., are prerequisites for any kind of group contagion. And I'm thinking, as I read their account years ago, that this would be extremely unlikely, at least in the earliest group appearances for Jesus, like the one to the women or to the 11 disciples so shortly after Jesus' gruesome crucifixion. Dale correctly responds that some of the same things could be applied to the New Testament resurrection accounts, such as referring especially to whether all of those in the group of 500 saw the exact same appearance of Jesus. Of course, neither that nor similar questions could be checked out with anyone from ancient times. We simply do not know these details with the 500 and the pre-Pauline Creed, so this specific question remains more open. But I think we can be pretty sure that we do know enough about some of the key leaders who were present in the group appearances of Jesus. This would apply to some of the 12 disciples, such as Peter and John, especially in Galatians 1-2, the Acts sermon summaries, or whatever scholars may grant concerning the gospel narratives. I think James needs to be put here too, even though there's no reason to think his was a group appearance. Or to later apostles, like Paul in Galatians 1-2 and elsewhere. We know enough to have a strong idea concerning these questions. We have less data for the best-known women, such as Jesus' mother or Mary Magdalene, but we can still draw good enough of a composite picture about them. At least the male followers of Jesus provided plenty of reason afterwards to assert that they saw Jesus similarly, as well as bodily, and I think that needs to be mentioned because so many of the discussion here has been aimed at non-bodily appearances, but the New Testament, I think, is pretty clear, based on their testimonies to the reported minimal facts. This would include such details as later responses of total transformation, witness, sold-out lives, and martyrdom for some of them. I think it's also important, not just the bodily aspect, but that they refer to appearances as resurrection appearances, not to some other sort of vision. We might wish we had still more material, but we do know enough. The second major conclusion
should have stopped.
All right, he's trying to get me to stop right now. The second major conclusion to be drawn regarding group events such as hallucination also concerns the nature of Jesus' resurrection appearances. Even in the critically ascertained literature, more group appearances were listed in the New Testament than those to individuals. Hence, it would be very difficult to dismiss the entirety of these accounts. I'll give two examples. Don Crossan, not considered to be conservative at all, lists 4 to 5 independent sources for group citations. And of all groups, the Jesus Seminar, if you can imagine this, in one of their major publications, a vote from their resident scholars said that Paul's creedal testimony in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and following, that testimony or its component parts is to be dated prior to Paul setting out on his journey to Damascus that led to his own conversion. It's very, very early, and that's when they're dating the 1 Corinthians 15 creed. Unbelieving naturalistic critics could hardly characterize the situation like this. Well, the only time that multiple mass hallucinations ever occurred to an individual over a short period of time, they happened to repeat it due to Jesus of Nazareth. End quote. I mean, how that can help them. Given the string of amazing reports concerning Jesus, especially group sightings, the natural hallucination hypothesis should now perhaps be called the natural group hallucination, natural group hallucination, natural group hallucination, and so on view. Close quote. The force here is seldom recognized. The point is that even if a comparatively small number of group hallucinations have been reported in the past, that several of them occurred to the same unique individual might itself be a miracle. This weakens the hallucination hypothesis considerably. But what about the Marian apparitions? Would these data provide rivals to Jesus' resurrection appearances? Several points might be made here. Initially, these reports are a real conundrum to researchers, and this is not simply due to non-Catholic or non-Orthodox judgments. As Dale rightly reminds us, the Catholic Church itself has rejected and even condemned many of these reports and, in Dale's words, quote, refused to endorse a slew of Marian apparitions, end quote. Yet after all is said and done on the subject, and in spite of his openness to the supernatural, Dale still rejects at least the most evidential of these Marian occurrences. These condemnations, rejections, and other serious objections alone may raise some doubts. Some of the additional issues here should also be mentioned. But a different viewpoint needs to be mentioned here. If the Marian apparition cases did not occur, then there's comparatively little to discuss. But if some of them are authentic, it must be remembered that these phenomena remain within the broader Christian camp. My point is that further research still needs to be done here, but the apparition cases, the Marian apparition cases, are by no means from rival religions. In this sense, narrow sense, they do not need to be refuted here. Second of 3 subjects, near-death experiences. Dale and I both share serious interests as well as several similar views on the subject of NDEs. My personal position here is that NDEs is that there's over 500 cases with which I'm familiar that are evidential in nature. And to me, they are able to establish at least the likelihood of an afterlife. I've divided the best evidential reports into 5 categories, summarizing these that have appeared in many medical and psychological journals. Literally dozens of these cases involve persons who have lacked both measurable heart and brain function. They had neither, according to the machines. Yet they reported later verified data from even far away, even miles, precisely during their shutdown times. These are just some of the amazing examples. Okay, the point in all this is that if there's an afterlife, this provides a potentially powerful head start that improves the probability of Jesus' resurrection appearances being factual even beyond the minimal facts. This follows from Jesus' resurrection and the strongest NDE cases, and that they both occur in the same supernatural territory of the afterlife. Of course, one could exist and not the other. Now, parenthetically, I'm not trying to say that NDEs show the resurrection is true. They don't. They'd be in the category of something like intelligent design or fine-tuning or arguments like that. But given that both arguments concern the same general realms and that both possess exceptionally strong evidence accompanying them, they are likely to function as a powerful one-two punch. Dale knows and appears to accept at least a goodly amount of this argument, and he applies it more than once to the downfall of the hallucination and similar theses. That might be a key. Here's his application. As one example, he provides for those who accept the reality of NDEs and similar events, quote, "We will be more inclined than others to entertain a non-hallucinatory genesis for the appearances of Jesus," end quote. So in other words, once you have the NDEs, it makes hallucinations rather rough, or at least you can explain them as straightforward events. And it is puzzling to me that Dale does not employ this connection between NDEs and Jesus' resurrection period more often. I'd like to have seen him bring it out more often when he's talking about hallucinations in other contexts and not mentioning these. Because it's a strong combination of arguments. It would appear that even a minimal case for the historical resurrection of Jesus is made substantially stronger by adding NDEs. And the hallucination thesis, particularly of the group variety along with similar responses, may be fading. There's some evidence that group hallucinations are being dropped by more and more critics. That's another point. Thirdly, comparisons to other belief systems. Dale also makes repeated references to religious traditions and movements such as Mormonism and contemporary Buddhism. For example, when dealing with the minimal facts argument, Dale addresses the Mormon witnesses to the original tablets that became the Book of Mormon, and surprisingly states that these details are, quote, highly evidential, close quote. Then Dale comments, quote, "We have nothing comparable for Christian origins," close quote. And I'm thinking, really? The chief points of response cannot be addressed here in detail, other than to say that numerous scholarly sources strongly dispute the historicity of this entire Mormon scenario. This includes Mormon sources. In fact, the evidential comparison between the New Testament and the Book of Mormon is not close. For example, even some of the original Mormon witnesses, the original ones, plus their leaders and Mormon sources from that same period, asserted that the witnesses never actually saw the uncovered plates. Further, this is really important. The three chief witnesses that are written in the front of many, if not most, or all, Book of Mormon's cases, press, says this: each of the three witnesses all either apostatized, left the Mormon church, or were reviled by their own leaders. Now I'm thinking as I'm writing this, let's think about our argument. Let's use Galatians 1. Paul goes up to Jerusalem to have a 2-week discussion with mostly with Peter. He also sees James. Oh, did I forget to tell you? Peter, James, and Paul all left the church a few years later, and they apostatized. But don't let that bother you. I'm thinking that would be a real blow, but it happened in this case. And the sources I cite are Mormon sources. It is difficult to know why Dale thought that the Mormon claims were, quote-unquote, highly evidential. Dale's chapter on recent Buddhism investigates cases of rainbow bodies, which are taught by some to indicate apotheosis of deceased Buddhist holy men. Dale begins his discussion of a particular Buddhist tradition by describing the treatment of a Tibetan holy man's body after his death in 1953. The body was wrapped and placed in a very small room. On the 8th day, when the burial wrapping was opened, all that remained was the holy man's nails and hair. The rest of his body was missing. A rainbow was observed over the house, and it was commonly taught from this and similar circumstances that the holy man's body had been absorbed into the heavenly light overhead. Interestingly, Dale provides rather detailed criticisms of his own of these Buddhist accounts from several angles, complete with his usual astuteness to possible natural explanations. To add some additional thoughts to Dale's own insightful critiques, how would these Buddhist reports fare if they were subjected to the same concentrated critiques that have been applied for at least 300 years to Jesus' resurrection accounts? How is it to be determined for sure that the holy man was actually dead? I mean, you know, sometimes people can control their breathing and put themselves actually into what appears to be at least a coma of sorts. Could someone have stolen or otherwise disposed of the deceased holy man's body in the meantime? Perhaps, because but to further add this to the story, what about the Tibetans as a whole? How about the various species of trickery, as in the days of Salmaxus of old, reported by Herodotus? How soon afterwards was the original story told, and by whom? Where are the lines of tradition, etc.? But since these accounts are probably best described generally as cases of apotheosis, how do they challenge resurrection cases? But my concern to raise this information here slightly elsewhere. If I am correct that Dale envisages several natural alternative ways to understand some of the Buddhist rainbow cases, he says that religious propaganda, quote unquote, is his preference, then why bring them up in the first place? If the portion involving the dead holy man can be explained naturally in one of several ways, then what would be a huge blow to the heavenly hypothesis account, if not this? Once again, why even propose the scenario of this chapter, given Dale's major problems with the underlying rainbow body itself? Further, I'd like to have a little fun here too. What if these Buddhist cases, if we conclude that, how do we know that rainbows can stand over one home? Now, they don't have to be one home, but how close is permissible? If the rainbow ended a quarter or half a mile away, would the story be told anyway? These are arguably many rainbows are typical in rainy Tibet. Most crucially, what is the specific nature of the causal connection between the missing dead body below and absorption into the clouds above? I don't get the significance of the body and, oh wow, a rainbow, well he must have gone up there. I don't get that connection. And if we're worried, Mike talked about it, if we're worried about did God raise Jesus, I want to know how we know something happened to the guy. Because just because there's a rainbow there, it's like, okay, so there's a rainbow there. So what is the bridge between these two? Apotheosis contention is very difficult for me to ascertain. Conclusion. Altogether, I conclude that the historical case for Jesus' resurrection appearance is based on minimal data is very strong. It is supported even by NDEs and similar research. But this collection is not the same as proof. Dale, along with each of us, knows that worldviews and personal emotions are amazingly obstinate and notoriously powerful. I still think there's enough potential data to change worldviews. This happened on many occasions in the New Testament, and it still occurs today. But thankfully, Dale makes it clear that he does not finally endorse these natural efforts. They may be the best of the skeptical position, but with all hypothesizing apart, this is not the best path of all. Leading to the final conclusion, Dale states that he knows no parallel to the Christian message. Quote, early Christianity offers us a missing body plus visions to several individuals plus collective apparitions, along the sense of Jesus' presence and the conversion of at least one outsider. Then Dale rather incredibly states, taken as a whole, this is on any account remarkable, even extraordinary confluence of events and claims. If there's a good substantial parallel to the entire series, I have yet to run across it, close quote. Far from leaving us in the dark, Dale actually affirmed the bottom line clearly in the opening lines of the second volume. He explained, I believe, quote, I believe that the disciples saw Jesus and that he saw them, and next Easter will find me in church, close quote. So the beginning of volume 2 is also the ending of the second resurrection volume.